I'd like to I'd want you all to keep these 7 questions in your mind. Number one, we talk about what correlations are. What are correlations? Number two, we talk about how is a correlation method different from an experiment. Number three, we talk about how do you collect data in a correlation method. Number four, how are the variables in a correlation method different from the variables that we have in an experiment. Number five, we talk about how are correlations different from causations. Number six, we talk about how do we differentiate between positive and negative correlations. And number seven, the last one, what is correlational coefficient? To get started with this real quick, number one, what are correlational methods? When we talk about correlations, we're talking about a relationship between any two variables, right? The relationship between any two variables, we simply, in a very simplistic manner, we refer to that as a correlation. The second question, how is correlation method different from an experiment? Do you know what? In an experiment, we manipulate our independent variable to see how this manipulation of an independent variable helps us with finding out our DV or finding out our the results of an experiment. However, when you talk about a correlational method on the other hand does not allow you to manipulate a variable, right? And to put it in a simplistic manner, what I'd like saying over here is, do you know what, when you talk about a correlation method, in a correlation method, if we talk about why we using a correlation method, we use it number one, if we want to, if there's, it's if it's not possible for us, if it's practically not possible for us or ethically permissible for us to be able to manipulate variables. आपके लिए जब ये प्रैक्टिकली पॉसिबल नहीं है या एथिकली परमिसिबल नहीं है कि आप अपने वेरिएबल्स को मैनिपुलेट कर सकें, तो आप इंस्टेड व्हाट यू डू इज यू ट्राई मेजरिंग देम, ठीक है? नाउ the third one, how do you collect data and correlations? You collect data and correlations through measuring your variables, like I said, because it's now not possible for you to manipulate your variables. If you would be able to manipulate your variables, you might as well conduct an experiment. Why would you want to conduct a correlation method in that case? ठीक है जी? तो आप correlation method अक्सर तब इस्तेमाल करते हैं जब आपके लिए practically possible ना हो कि आप अपने variables को manipulate कर सकें. Instead, what you do is you try measuring them. अब the fourth question, how are variables measured in a correlation method? By using quantitative data. How do you measure something? By numbers, right? Statistic representation, right? हम अपने variables को measure कर रहे होते हैं through quantitative data. The fifth question over here, how are correlations different from causations? When you talk about correlations के अंदर, like I said, because you're trying to figure out the relationship between two variables. देखिए, causation comes from the word a cause, a causal effect, cause and effect relationship. ये सारे terms हम लोग use करते हैं to refer to experiments, ठीक है जी? तो when you talk about an experiment, like I said, through an experiment, you figure out the cause and effect relationship by manipulating your independent variables and seeing how it affects your dependent variable. However, when you talk about a correlation method, you're just trying to figure out the relationship between two variables. The sixth question, how do we differentiate between positive and negative correlations? Now, when we talk about differentiating between positive and negative correlations in a simplistic manner, if both the variables, they're going up at the same time or they're decreasing, if they're increasing at the same time or they're decreasing at the same time, we refer to that as a positive correlation. However, if one of the variable goes up and the other comes down, if one increases and the other one decreases, or the other way around, we refer to that as a negative correlation. In a simplistic manner, if I say the amount of efforts, the amount of time you spend studying is correlated to the grade you get. In this case, what I'm mean to say over here is, अगर आप अपना पढ़ाई का ड्यूरेशन इंक्रीज कर रहे हो तो आपका ग्रेड के बेहतर आने के चांसेस ज्यादा हैं, तो that's a positive correlation. Or in other words, I mean the other way around as well, if you're not studying enough, then it's highly likely that your grade would come down, it would drop down. And on the other hand, if I try giving an example of a negative correlation over here, you know what, the amount of, I mean, this is something you usually get to hear from your mothers as well, you know, the amount of time you spend with your gadgets is again negatively correlated with the grade you get. Or in other words, to put it in a simplistic manner, जितना ज़्यादा time अपने आप अपने gadgets के साथ, अपने cellular phone, Netflix के साथ spend करते हो, उतना आपका grade drop down होने के chances ज़्यादा हैं. और हम ये भी कह सकते हैं कि जितना कम टाइम आप स्पेंड करते हो अपना गैजेट्स के साथ, उतना ज़्यादा चांसेस हैं दैट यू एंड अप performing better. Now, what is a correlational coefficient? You know, when you talk about a correlation coefficient, I'd like to use this picture over here to help you understand this in a better manner. You see, we this over here we have zero over here. ठीक है जी. अब जितना ज़्यादा आप जितना ज़्यादा आपका the value that you work through, right? Of course, when you talk about psychology, they wouldn't really ask you to measure correlations, yeah. But you know, the more chances, the more your value, I mean, whatever you figured out, it's closer to +1. We refer to that as a positive correlation, right? Agar aapki value, whatever the findings are, if they're closer to +1, we refer to that as a positive correlation. If they're closer to -1, we refer to that as a negative correlation. And the figures in between, the numbers in between, we refer to that as a correlational coefficient. If you have a look at this, this says a correlational coefficient is a number between -1 and +1 that expresses how strong a correlation is, right? And on the other hand, the closer your value is to zero, that means there's no correlation to be found. ठीक है जी. Zero से जितनी ज्यादा आपकी value increase होती जाएगी, उतना ज्यादा strong होता जाएगा आपका positive correlation. On the other hand, zero से जितनी आपकी value decrease होती जाएगी, उतना ज्यादा chances होंगे of your you having a strongly negative correlation. ठीक है जी. अब another thing that I missed on earlier, you know what, when we talk about case studies are a research method. Of course, they're a part of a syllabus as well, but when we talk about case studies get through upload, if you're using a case study, you ought to have a separate data collection technique, right, that you'd be using. So case studies अगर आप इस्तेमाल कर रहे होते हो, तो for a case study you would either use a self-report measure, observational method, or any other testing method. Likewise, when you talk about a correlational method, this is not a data collection technique. Or in other words, if you're using a correlational method, you would have to come up with some or the other data collection technique like self-reports, questionnaires, interviews, different tests, so on and so forth. I hope this helps. I'd appreciate if you could pause this and give this a thorough read. This to be the first slide, this one to be the second slide, and this one happens to be the third slide. Thank you.